So for this step in the OpArt exercise, we're going to be looking at using layers for the first time and also just the way that Illustrator uses and utilizes the workspace slightly differently than how Photoshop does. So I have this left over from the last step and I did a little bit of work on it. But before I go any further, I want to just start bringing in this inspiration image because I have my shape tool down and I'm starting to figure out how to use shapes, and now I actually want to be looking at something to be pulling some different strategies and visual components from that original inspiration image to apply to this graphic. So I just want to emphasize that this really is for people to have a little bit of a direction, so they're not just adding a bunch of effects and a bunch of filters and doing a bunch of abstract shapes with little to no reason other than just experimenting, and that's really important to do. But I found that when you're targeting or when you're strategizing with these different processes and these tools, even when you're experimenting, when you have a little bit of a goal in mind, whether it's visual or more of a technique, it really helps you push the tools to their full potential. So instead of creating images where your final output is dictated by how you know how to use the tools, or what their default settings are, or what the easiest way to use them, or the more simple way to use them. Instead, you're understanding tools a little bit more in depth, and so you're really getting to know them and to know what is possible, and at least to get to know them to a point where you know, okay, well, this actually isn't possible using this tool, but maybe this combination of tools. So that's why I have this larger goal of working with the OpArt piece, and I just wanted to clarify that. So I'm not asking people to make a direct copy of anything, but I do want people to have some visual similarities or technical similarities, or some kind of strategy that you're pulling from these as inspiration as you're creating your own images. So that can be in the visual form, it can be in the optical effect, it can be in the color, it can be the use of shapes, or it can be a combination of those things. But I just want to be able to see that inspiration in the images that you are submitting for this exercise. So first step to that is to actually be able to see that image while you're working on something. So this is one cool thing about Illustrator. You can utilize this gray area outside of your canvas to store things, or to have visual elements or illustration elements that maybe you're not using in the moment, but you still are still kind of part of that idea or that larger visual goal that you're trying to achieve with that image. So it actually allows you to kind of put things off to the side. So I'm going to first show that here. I'm going to move this just simply off the white artboard and into this gray workspace. And this is still on this layer. And if I select all, it still is selected, so it's still a part of this file, but when I go to export this, it's not going to be included in whatever that image is. So this is kind of a place where you can put extra things, and you can also do this with hidden layers, but sometimes it can be nice to have something off to the side that isn't disrupting your image space, but is something that you can be actively looking at within the same file. So I have these shapes here. I'm not sure if I'm going to use them or not again for this exercise, but I want to keep them just because it did take me a couple minutes to make them. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually open up one of the inspiration images and bring it directly into this workspace. So to do this, I'm going to go up to File and Open, or Command O, and I know where this image is in my computer, where it lives, so I'm going to grab it and I'm going to say Open. And so similar to Photoshop, Illustrator, you're allowed to have multiple files open at once, and you can see them here in these tabs. And the way to switch back and forth quickly between them is to do Command tilde. So I could just be doing this and using this as my reference image, but the other thing that you can do with anything within two files, so obviously this is not a vector file, this is just a pixel-based image. Illustrator can still open those images and you can still have those within your vector objects, but you can't go and edit things pixel by pixel the way that you can in Photoshop. So you can have pixel-based images be parts of your final pieces. You can use them as guides, and that's what we're going to be doing more for this exercise. Or they can be a final part of whatever you export, but you just can't edit them the same way that you can in Photoshop. So what I like to do is, if I am going to include some kind of photo, and then maybe I'm going to have some vector illustrations on top of that photo, I'll make sure that I do all those edits in Photoshop, and then the last step is combining the vectors and the pixels together. And depending upon what your final output is, you either do that by taking your vectors and then placing them into the Photoshop file, or you take your bitmap image from your Photoshop file and place it into Illustrator. But we're not doing that for this exercise. I just want to show people how they can actually bring this reference material into their file. So I'm going to copy this, Command-C, switch back to my other file that I'm working with, and then Command-Paste. Whoa. Let's make sure that worked. Command-Paste, there it is. Okay. So now I have this, and I'm going to have this over here in the workspace area, and I'm going to save this. And so this is always going to be a part of this file now until I delete it. So one word of caution when you're doing this, I know that this image is about 500 pixels wide, and you can see it is a little bit pixelated. It's fine because I'm just using this as a reference image. It's not going to be part of my final image. If you have really high resolution photographs or pixel-based images as part of your Illustrator file, it will make your Illustrator file very, very big. So as much as you can, you want to use really small or lower resolution images when you're creating, when you're using reference material, or when you're using photographs as like guides for creating illustrations, which we'll be doing a little bit later in this course. However, you don't, if you are going to be using something for the actual part of a final image, what might be best is to take a low-res snapshot of that, just so you can get the proportions right, and then at the very end, you can combine the two. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more specifically when we're going to be doing it. So just keep in mind, you don't want to have many pixel-based images within your Photoshop file, or sorry, your Illustrator file. One or two is fine, as long as, especially if they're low res. But if you're dealing with really big photos that you're including as your reference material, it might make your Illustrator files really, really big all of a sudden. So in terms of memory, so you might not, it might slow down your computer, and then if you don't have a lot of space on your hard drive or on your flash drive, it might also make it so that you can't actually save your files. So as soon as you do this, you want to save it, and if you notice it slowing down, then you can just, what I would suggest doing is deleting it, saving it again, and then trying to bring in a low resolution version. So you can do that in Photoshop. We talked about that. Okay, all right, so now I have this, and the last thing I want to talk about are layers and how you can work with layers in Illustrator and use them to your advantage. So even when you're dealing with Illustrator, you have a program that is treating each of the different objects independently, so you don't have to worry about the pixel overwriting that happens with Photoshop in terms of any pixels that are overlapping in a single layer, they're going to overwrite each other. So that doesn't happen in Illustrator. However, when you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of objects, then it can actually be a lot easier to work with layers, and it allows you to have more flexibility when you're trying to navigate through your image space. So just to show an example of this, I'm going to start using these circles a little bit more. So I'm going to just create a field of circles. So let me do this really quickly. So just, this can be a good time to get some practice with these shortcuts. I'm holding down Option, and then I am trying to make this field as quickly as possible. Let's see here. Okay. So I want this to extend to the edges. So I'm going to transform all these together. by holding down Shift. I'm maintaining the aspect ratio. And it's snapping. Just a little bit annoying, but that's okay. All right. And now I'm going to align to selection and make sure those are all aligned to the top. And then I'm going to select align to artboard and then align this to the top of the canvas. And so that seems good. I'm going to select all of those. Oh, that's right. I'm going to horizontally distribute them. And now I'm going to group them. And now I'm going to make multiple rows. And just trying to make this as fast as possible. So this is where the shortcuts really pay off. And I'm sure there's even faster ways to do this. Okay, and so now let's see, I want to make sure that these are all vertically distributed. All right, so I have pretty much a perfect grid of circles. Oh yeah, and the last step is I want to slowly change the color from dark to light. Oops, well, I'll just do this. So I'm just doing this by eye right now, and I will actually be able to show people how to do this a little bit more specifically and automatically later in the course. And there, okay. So actually, let's just do, I'm going to delete that. And then I'm going to take this, I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to rotate it. Right, and oops. Just make sure that these are all horizontally distributed. Okay, or vertically distributed. Okay, so now I have this, and this is all on one layer, and I'm going to go to my Layers tab, and I'm actually going to cut this right now. So I'm going to go up to Edit, I'm going to go to Cut, it's also Command X, and this is disappear from this layer. I'm going to go here, I'm going to create a new layer, and then I'm going to go up to Edit, and I'm going to do something called Paste in Place. So I could just paste this and it would show up more in the center of the screen, but if you go to Paste in Place, which is Command-Shift-V, it will paste it directly in the spot where it was when you cut it. So that's a nice little time-saving thing when you're trying to deal with different layouts and maintaining that. So this way, now I have all my reference material and some of the stuff that I'm not sure I'm going to use in my final image, but I don't want to just delete. I have that in my layer 1, and then I have all the stuff that I'm working on actively in this artboard, or sorry, on my canvas in layer 2. So this way, if I go into layer 1 and lock it by hitting this little, it's an empty box, but it turns into a lock toggle. I lock it. When I then select all, it's only selecting the objects on the layers that are unlocked. So that is a really big time saver. So this way, I can edit things in layer 2 and know that I'm not going to accidentally create or edit things or change things that are on layer 1. So I'm going to change the name of this to Guide Layer. And so the layers really behave very similarly to how they do in Photoshop. You can move them around and change their order by just dragging them up and down in the Layers tab. And then you create new ones by hitting that little Create New Layer icon. You delete entire layers by hitting that trash icon. And then if you click on this little settings box here, when you have a layer selected, you can also do things like duplicate them. So I'm going to actually duplicate layer 2. And so now I have this as a copy, but I'm going to just change this to layer 3. And so you can't tell now because obviously this is duplicated and they're in the exact same place. But now I have, when I select this, so I've locked layer 2, and I'm going to move this around. So now you see I actually have two layers that are interacting with one another. And so the same thing holds true here. Once I have what was the circles in layer 2 locked, when I select all, I am only selecting what's in layer 3. However, if I unlock layer 2 and layer 3, then I can actually move multiple things at once. And that is a big difference between Photoshop and Illustrator, is that you can select between layers pretty automatically. So it's just, you switch between layers by clicking whatever object or shape happens to be within that layer. And you don't have to actually manually go over here and select different layers. So it can be helpful sometimes and expedite things sometimes. Other times it can be a little bit confusing. And then let me change the order here so everyone can see. Okay, yeah, so there's a lot of things that you can do with layers. So in terms of this project, some cool things that you can do, let me lock this, bring this back, pretty quickly is using this idea of these duplicated layers and these groups. You can create these illusions or change things like color and also change blending modes the same way that you can in Photoshop. So I'm going to select all of these objects and I'm going to go up to the transparency icon, which is these two overlapping circles. You can also get to that by going to Window and then going to Transparency. And so unlike Photoshop, you can have objects on the same layer that have different blending modes, which is pretty cool. I'm just going to change the blending mode of all the objects on one layer right now, but just know that you can actually, well, actually I won't do that on all of them. I'll just go one group at a time. So I have this group selected, and this is all in layer 3 right now because layer 2 is locked. And then I'm going to change this to multiply. Then I'm going to select this one and change it to multiply. And then I'm just going to go through, and I'm actually going to hide layer 2 for a minute, just so I can more easily shift-click every other one of these. And then I'm going to go up here and I'm going to change their blending mode to multiply. And that again is under the transparency tab. I'm going to go back to my layers tab. And now you can start seeing how this is starting to change the way that these two layers are interacting with one another. I believe you can also change the entire appearance of a layer by going to this, by selecting this little circle and then going to this appearance. But let's get into that in the next, after this. Okay, so that's one way that you can start working with overlays, utilizing layers. So I'm actually going to hide this layer, and I think I'm actually going to delete it. Yes. So I also want to show that you can have different things. You don't have to make duplicate layers. You can just make a totally new layer and then create new objects. So I've created a new layer that's below layer 2 now. So I'm going to go here and then just create a solid color. And then extend that down. So I've created this solid color, and this is it looks like it's a background color, but it's essentially just a rectangle with out an outline applied to it, and then with this blue fill. And so this is already, it's filling in what was once white as the background. It's now showing up as a color, and it's already starting to produce this interesting effect. And if I go here and start to change this color, you can see it does different things as I change the shade of this color. And so this gives me an interesting idea. I could sit here and start making different rows of this color on this layer that's below. And so hopefully you're seeing how if this was all on one layer, it would start to getting really, really confusing. But because I'm able to lock all of these circles, And the layer above, I'm able to make these edits without doing anything to that locked layer. So it's really streamlining this process. And so now I can go through and start to change some of these. And so this is actually going to be changing the way that the eye sees these different colors because of the background color. And so there's a lot of opportunity here to start creating these different effects and these different optical illusions. So whether you're working with contrast to create a sense of movement, or you're trying to change the way a color appears, even if it's the same color based on the background color, and that's something that we talked about a little bit in previous modules. But these are all different ways that you can start to use these different capabilities of Illustrator to develop these distorted and optical illusion images that are inspired by these op art paintings. Okay, so I think that's it for layers. And the next step will be going into editing shapes and then also using the pen tool a little bit and creating lines. So make sure to save your work and then continue to follow through these steps.